Hi, I'm Basma Albanna, a founding member of the Data Powered-Positive Deviance initiative and a lecturer at the Faculty of Computer and Information Sciences at Ain Shams University in Cairo. In this lecture, I'll present the Data Powered-Positive Deviance method, which I have developed over the course of my Ph.D. through applying it in a number of action research projects and case studies with development practitioners. So what is the positive deviance approach and how did all of this start? The story began in 1990 when the Vietnamese government invited Save the Children Foundation to help overcome the problem of child malnutrition. At that time, Jerry Stirnen, the guy in the picture, was the Save the Children program director. He was asked to demonstrate impact within 6 months, and instead of going for the traditional supplemental feeding programs, he decided to look for well-nourished children in extremely poor villages, wondering they might have the solution. He undertook a village survey of child height and weight, and to his surprise, he found 6 such families and began to study them intensively. By observing the food preparation, cooking, and serving behaviors of these families, he found 3 consistent yet rare behaviors. Mothers of those children added to their children's diet tiny shrimps from the rice paddies and the greens from the sweet potato tops. They washed their children's hands every time they came in contact with anything unclean. And they fed their children less per meal but more often, 4 to 5 times per day, compared to the 2 times in regular families. Stirnen and his team then scaled out those simple, affordable, and community-inspired practices, and within 2 years, this had reduced malnutrition by 80% in 250 communities, rehabilitating an estimated 50,000 malnourished children. The approach that Stirnen used and operationalized later on is called the positive deviance approach. It is based on the observation that in every community or organization, a few individuals or groups use uncommon practices and strategies to achieve better outcomes than their peers who are facing the same challenges and barriers. Those individuals or groups are referred to as positive deviants, and adopting their solutions is referred to as the positive deviance approach. So what are the 5 basic steps of the positive deviance approach? The first step is to define the problem and determine desirable outcomes that you want to achieve. After that, you look into the population and you start looking for the positive deviants, the ones who are achieving better outcomes than their peers despite facing similar challenges. The third step would to start to look into the underlying factors that led to the positive outcomes, the practices, the strategies, the attitudes of those positive deviants. The first step is to design interventions to disseminate and scale those practices, and usually community participatory methods are used intensively in this step specifically to mobilize and scale those solutions. The 5th step is to monitor and evaluate the PD interventions and to make sure or to assess whether they were able to achieve the desired outcomes. What is so different about positive deviance? Why is it a really valuable development approach? So, when you're dealing with adaptive problems requiring behavioral change, usually technical solutions and top-down solutions are not effective and not sustainable. For example, Stirnen, for not using the traditional supplemental feeding programs, he decided not to use them because their impact lasts only throughout the duration of the program and they don't last beyond the program duration. In such cases, when those problems are complex and require behavioral change, positive deviance fits better. Because positive deviance capitalizes on the collective wisdom of the people, it is context and culture aware. This makes it less vulnerable to social rejection, which is another very important point. When it comes to sustainability, since it relies on local resources and knowledge, it reduces the reliance on aid and external expertise, which makes it more sustainable than traditional approaches. And finally, when people see people like them achieving the desired outcome, they believe they have the ability to succeed, something that we refer to as self-efficacy. So what is the data-powered positive deviance then? And how is it different than the positive deviance approach? The data-powered positive deviance builds on the positive deviance approach, but the innovation here comes in the use of non-traditional data. The increasing availability of non-traditional data about what we do and say generated from the digital devices and sensors can be used to identify a whole new range of abnormal behavior. And by non-traditional data here, I'm referring to digital data and data that is digitally mediated, observed, or recorded. So data such as social media data, remote sensing data, open data, or online data, and mobile data. The use of such data can reduce the initial time and cost needed for PD identification. Currently, the positive deviants rely on primary data collection, which is time and cost intensive because it's proportional, or the costs of doing so are proportional to the sample size. So the more you're going to use it, or the larger the sample, the more costly it will become. By using existing and readily available non-traditional data, you're reducing this initial time for PD identification. Another reason is because such data and such digital data have large geographical and temporal coverage. This enabled the discovery of positive deviance at geographical and temporal scales that weren't possible before. So, if we're going to compare positive deviance and data-powered positive deviance, so the data-powered positive deviance, to recap, combines traditional and non-traditional data to identify and characterize positive deviance in new ways and domains, while the positive deviance approach relies mainly on traditional data to characterize and identify positive deviance. So this is the key difference between both approaches when it comes to the data sources. When it comes to the performance measure, in the positive deviance approach, you usually rely on manually recorded or observed performance indicators, similar to what Sternen did. He went to the village, recorded the weight and height of the children, and based on it identifies the abnormal families or the abnormal children. In the data-powered positive deviance, we are relying mainly on digitally recorded or observed performance indicators. In the positive deviance approach, the performance is viewed at a single point of time, so it's more of a cross-sectional view. In the data-powered positive deviance approach, the performance can be looked into both cross-sectional view, and it also enables having a longitudinal view due to the temporal coverage that is provided by the digital data sources. When it comes to the unit of the analysis, the positive deviance approach are usually looking into individuals, while in data-powered positive deviance, it enables looking into aggregation levels that are beyond individuals, such as villages, such as regions, countries, or any geographical unit. And this enables also looking into the collective behavior of units instead of just the behavior of individuals. In the positive deviance approach, usually the explanators or the factors explaining positive deviance are at the level of individuals. So they could be individual attributes, practices, and strategies. While in the data-powered positive deviance method, it enables looking into both individual and supra-individual factors that are factors beyond the control of individuals, such as how policies are impacting the performance of villages, or how a certain intervention increased yields in a certain area or a governance scheme. So, just to give you an example of how and where we applied the data-powered positive deviance method. So as I previously mentioned, this method was developed during my Ph.D. At the University of Manchester. And my first application for the method was in a research performance case study that looked into information system researchers in Egypt who were able to achieve better research outcomes than their peers. And then I used Google Scholar citation data and used online data and data on the university website to identify those researchers. And then I did field work to try to explain why they're achieving better outcomes. Following this case study, we partnered, and by we I mean my supervisor, Professor Richard Heeks, and myself, we partnered with the GIZ Data Lab and the UNDP Accelerator Labs and Pulse Lab Jakarta in a global collaborative, which is the Data Powered Positive Deviance Initiative. And here we started to try and test this method in different domains and applications. So the first testing was with Pulse Lab Jakarta in Indonesia, where we looked into farmers who achieve higher than expected rice productivity using remote sensing data. Following that, we applied it in 4 different pilots, such as identifying safer public spaces for women in Mexico City using open data, cattle farmers in Ecuador who deforest less than their peers using remote sensing data, farmers who achieve higher than expected cereal crop productivity in Niger, similar to Indonesia, and communities in Somalia that preserve their rangeland despite frequent droughts using remote sensing data. And we also used open data to identify districts in Germany that are better able to contain the spread of COVID-19 infections. The 5 steps, or the 5 main steps and stages of applying the data-powered positive deviance method are very, very similar to the steps and stages applied in the positive deviance approach, but the difference here is to try to accommodate and make use of the large size of big data and non-traditional data, and at the same time, the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence techniques to identify those outliers or positive deviance. But the most crucial stage is stage 1, where instead of just defining the problem, it's extremely important to assess if this problem fits the method and if you can lend this problem to the data-powered positive deviance method. So in the coming slides, I'm going to take you step by step and stage by stage in order to see how data-powered positive deviance method is applied. And there will be a running example for the Somalia case study to aid the understanding of the method. So in stage 1, assessing problem method fit, we start by defining the problem, assessing suitability, assessing feasibility, and assessing desirability. When it comes to defining the problem, it is important to specify 4 main things. What is the pain and the problem that we're trying to solve? Who are what is the study population or the target group, which is the group of individuals, communities, or geographic units who are suffering from or causing the problem and will be included in the analysis. The third extremely important aspect is identifying the unit of analysis. At what level are we expecting to find a solution? Is it at the individual level? Is it at the village level? Or is it at the country level? And finally, the desired outcome is the state you want your target group to reach through this intervention. So it's important to define all of those. In the case of Somalia, The problem that we had are the frequent droughts that are threatening the pastoral livelihoods. The target group or the study population was the West Gulis area, a region at the north of Somalia, specifically in Somaliland, with a majority of a pastoral community. The unit of analysis were 5-kilometer buffers around the settlements that will be used to represent the villages. And the desired outcome was to reach healthier rangeland that will enable pastoralists to maintain and enhance their livelihoods. The key question was, how can we protect natural grazing resources through sustainable rangeland management practices? And those practices were, the idea was to look for rangeland that are achieving better and using them as entry points to identify and source those solutions. After defining the problem, it's extremely important to assess the suitability of using positive deviance in this problem. And assessing suitability asks two main questions. One question is related to the nature of the problem. Is there a behavioral change, or is this an adaptive problem that requires a behavioral change? If yes, then it is most likely a problem that can lend itself to the positive deviance approach. The second key question is to ask, are there positive deviants? Are you aware of any of them? Are they known to exist? If the answer to this question is yes, then this problem is also a problem that you can lend to the positive deviance approach. Ideally, in this diagram, what we would want to find, or what we would like the problem to lie in this quadrant, where positive deviants are likely to exist, and identifying and scaling their practices could have a significant impact on the problem because the problem is an adaptive problem and might require behavioral change. After assessing the suitability of the problem, it's extremely important to assess the feasibility of the problem. And when assessing the feasibility, there are three main types of data that we need to look into and make sure that they exist: outcome data, behavioral data, and contextual data. Outcome data will capture the performance of our units of analysis. The behavioral data will uncover positively deviant practices, and the contextual data will identify positive deviance in relation to their context and help us control for external factors. In the data-powered positive deviance method, the outcome data usually came from non-traditional data. The behavioral data was the data that we used to get from the traditional data by doing interviewing and surveying of the positive deviants. And the contextual data was used with a mix of non-traditional and traditional data. For instance, in the Somalia case, we used the remote sensing data to capture the outcomes of our unit of analysis, which was the 5-kilometer buffer around the settlements. We used climate data and settlement locations as contextual data. So climate data such as precipitation, temperature were extremely important to control for external factors that might be the reason why rangeland health is deteriorating. And we have to control for those factors because in the end, we want to focus on the behavioral data and the behavioral factors, which will be extracted using interviews, surveys, and observations. The last step when it comes to defining the problem and assessing the problem method fit is ensuring the desirability and assessing the desirability. So here, we want to make sure that in this step, it's important to look closely at those individuals and communities that stand to benefit or lose from the identification and the amplification of the practices, strategies, and other factors associated with the outperformers. So you have to make sure that the positive deviants wouldn't shy away or wouldn't resist scaling their practices in fear of a certain competitive advantage. You also need to make sure that scaling those practices wouldn't affect the social system at large or wouldn't have a negative impact on the non-positive deviance. In stage 2, after defining the problem and assessing the problem method fit, it's extremely important to start looking for the positive deviance and determining them. And this stage has 4 main steps: measuring the performance, dividing the study population into homogeneous groups, identifying positive deviance, and validating the positive deviance identified. So for the case of Somalia, those were our unit of analysis, the 5-kilometer buffers surrounding the settlements. The first step was to extract the performance of the target group using a digitally recorded or observed outcome measure. And here we use the savi, which is the Soil Adjusted Vegetation Index. It's a remote sensing derived measure that enables us to identify the health of the rangelands across time. So here, the greener areas are the areas that are having healthier vegetation, and the yellowish reddish areas are the ones who are having bad vegetation health. The next step is to divide this group divide the target group or the population into peer groups that are having very similar conditions. In the Somalia case, we use 2 main things: the land cover and the rainfall. So the peer group are the groups here to the right, which are having a similar color, and the ones who are having similar color are having very similar livelihoods and very similar rainfall or precipitation conditions and patterns. After dividing them into peer groups comes the stage of identifying the positive deviance within the same peer group. And here we identified a number of villages, around 13 communities, that are performing extremely better than the others. And from the diagram, you can also see that the greener areas are the areas that are having healthier vegetation, and the red areas to the extreme west, lying at the west, are the ones who are having very bad vegetation health. After identifying the positive deviance, it's extremely important to validate the identified positive deviance, because with big data comes a lot of noise, and you want to ensure that what you're identifying is not just noise, but is actually leading to something of value before doing the costly process of field work and uncovering the underlying practices. And here we used high-resolution imagery on the communities that we suspected are potential positive deviants. And we started seeing some interesting patterns and techniques that were observable using remote sensing data and satellite imagery, such as those half-moon techniques on the right that are known to reduce water runoff. And on the left, you can see a shrub barrier in the front line with soil erosion to limit its crawling. So, as you can see, we started with extensive use of non-traditional data at the beginning. And as we are going further in the steps, we're using more traditional data to try to explain what we're seeing. At the same time, we started with a large sample size at the beginning, and as we're going further, the sample size is reduced into a small sample of information-rich units that will be targeted for the qualitative inquiry. So the next step or the next stage is to start to discover the underlying factors. And here, the main thing is to start by planning for field work, collecting the data, and analyzing the data. But when it comes to data collection, it's extremely important to follow this 6-step approach. So you start by gathering the data from the positive deviance. You start for looking for patterns within the positive deviance. You start by generating hypotheses about those patterns and about what could be the factors underlying the good performance. And then you develop quantitative data collection tools that were informed by those hypotheses and other theoretical or conceptual frameworks in the literature. You collect data from positive and non-positive deviance to be able to ensure that those factors and those hypotheses are exclusive to positive deviance, and there are statistically significant differences between both groups. In the case of Somalia, we were able to identify practices such as loose stones or those half-moon techniques that reduce water runoff, that communities did community land enclosures instead of private land enclosures. And they started to have other sources of income and alternative sources of income in addition to pastoral activities such as beekeeping and agriculture activity to accommodate with the variation that can be caused with climate change. So those are some of the practices that we were able to identify by going to Somalia and uncovering those practices. The next step after identifying those practices and strategies comes the stage of designing and implementing interventions. And depending on what we found, you can either come up with community interventions or you can come up with policy interventions. Community interventions come from individual level factors that are transferable. And usually the way they are applied, they are community-led. As I mentioned previously, they rely mainly on participatory methods where you bring the non-positive deviants with the positive deviants and they learn and see from themselves how this scaling or how those solutions are working. So an example would be soil and water conservation techniques or sustainable cattle ranching practices, and where non-positive deviants would see and learn from the positive deviants how to do them. The alternative approach will be policy interventions. And the policy interventions come from the supra-individual factors, things that are transferable but are beyond the control of individuals. Things that are usually organization-led, such as the government reserves, for instance. So we learned by going into the Somalian communities that the government reserves are extremely useful and important for them when there are droughts, and they reduce the pressure on the communal rangelands when they are facing climate stresses. After designing and implementing those community/policy interventions comes the stage of monitoring and evaluating those interventions. And here you can use the traditional monitoring and evaluation techniques, but the only difference is that when it comes to measuring the outcomes, before and after the intervention, you can actually use the same digital outcome that was used to measure their outcomes before. So if you use like remote sensing data before, you can use the same remote sensing measure, for instance, in Somalia, the savi index, to see if certain interventions had an effect. When it comes to the analysis, it is best used to use before versus after designs, such as randomized control trials or quasi-experimental designs. And then when it comes to dissemination after the analysis, here you ask the question, how will the results of the data collection be disseminated across the different stakeholders? It's important to enable the community members to tell their stories and coach others within their networks to maintain this great value of positive deviance, which is the idea of the self-efficacy. For the references in this presentation, I used two main resources. The Data-Powered-Positive Deviance, combining traditional and non-traditional data to identify and characterize development-related outperformers. You can find this open access paper on the development in the Development Engineering Journal. And my second paper on Positive Deviance, Big Data and Development, a systematic literature review, which is found in the Electronic Journal of Information Systems in Developing Countries. There's also an extremely useful guide that you can use, which is the DPPD Handbook, a step-by-step guide for development practitioners to apply the data-powered-positive deviance method. I provided the link in the presentation, and you can look it up on the website, datapowered-pd.org. In this website, you will find information on all the pilot projects that were part of this initiative, and in the resources tab, you will find direct links to all the resources and references that I used. This brings me to the end of this lecture. I hope you found it useful and you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for listening.